Hello everyone, my name is Fabian Riethmayer. I'm going to talk about human interface guidelines and the role they play in an ecosystem, how they help with consistency and speed up development. I've been working on KDE's human interface guidelines for the last couple of years. My work is primarily focused on improving the structure, presentation, and the existing content, and not so much on creating new content, creating new interface patterns or UI elements. So just a short what I'm going to talk about. First, what is a human interface guideline? Then I'm going to show a couple overview of some existing human interface guidelines, talk about the role of human interface guidelines in an ecosystem, and take a more detailed look into aspects of human interface guidelines. So what is a user interface? It's a space where interactions happen between humans and machines. This is a very broad definition and covers a whole lot more than just computers and mobile phones. But it also covers every kind of heavy machinery, operator controls, or industrial processes. The user interface typically consists of some physical input device for the human to interact and one or more output devices for the machine to interact. The most common input devices are keyboards, mice, gamepads, remote controls, touchscreens, and the most common output devices are for visual feedback like monitors or printers, or auditory feedback like speakers. But you can have output devices for all other human senses as well. One more well-known example would be the force feedback controller for consoles like the Xbox or the PlayStation, where you have feedback from the machine when the controller vibrates. So human interface guidelines are a set of rules to guide interaction between humans, and for this talk at least, desktops and mobile phones. Let's get on to some examples. There are many different human interface guidelines on the web. The most common ones, or the most well-known ones, are those for the large ecosystems. For example, Google Material Design for Android, iOS, Flutter, and the web. I guess everyone has seen it in some way or the other. Or Apple Human Interface Guidelines. Actually, Apple provides not one guideline, but four. While Google has one big guideline that covers everything, Apple provides a set of guidelines, one for macOS, one for iOS, one for watchOS, and one for tvOS. Of course, Microsoft has its own human interface guidelines too, or rather several of them. They have a guideline for the Universal Windows platform. They have one for Windows 32, one for Windows Presentation Foundations, and one for Windows Forms. And while Apple has four guidelines too, it's pretty straightforward which one to choose, depending on the device you want to develop for. But if you want to develop for Microsoft, you need to choose human interface guideline depending on the technology you want to develop with. Or you need to choose the technology you want to develop with if you want to develop against one particular human interface guideline. In my opinion, it's pretty unfortunate to have different human interface guidelines for different technologies because it makes it so much harder to choose. So then, of course, there's GNOME's human interface guidelines and KDE's human interface guidelines. Actually, when I started to work at KDE's Human Interface Guidelines, we had a similar problem as Microsoft has now, or still has. We had two human interface guidelines you had to choose between, depending on the technology you wanted to develop this. On the one hand, there was the classic huge widgets one, and on the other hand, there was a QML and Kirigami one with a new set of controls, UI elements, and navigational patterns. And to some extent, we still have this problem, but as QML and Kirigami matured, things improved quite a bit, and we are back to only have one guideline for both worlds. What all these human interface guidelines I just showed have in common, they cover a very, very wide range of devices, a wide range of use cases for applications. There are all kinds of applications in each of these environments. But there are human interface guidelines with a very different and very much narrowed scope as well. For example, there's a human interface guideline for LG's WebOS that are just narrowed in their scope, they're just for TVs. So they only target one class of devices and only a very reduced set of applications. The applications you typically find on a TV are smaller and less complex than in the other environments we saw earlier, and center around of the consume of media. But but also something like LibreOffice has its own set of guidelines. So it's not only human interface guidelines for platform, ecosystems, or devices, but there's a human interface guidelines for applications, for single applications as well. Like you can see here from LibreOffice, or there's a human interface guideline from Blender. So after we saw some examples of different human interface guidelines you can find in the web, what role are they actually playing in an ecosystem? Let's see what some of the human interface guidelines themselves say about their role. This is from KDE. So the KDE Human Interface Guideline offers designers and developers a set of recommendations for producing beautiful, usable, and consistent user interfaces for convergent desktop and mobile applications and workspace widgets. Their aim is to improve the experience for users by making applications and widget interfaces more consistent and hence more intuitive and learnable. Let's take a look at the second one. This is from Google. Build beautiful products faster. Material is a design system that helps teams build high-quality digital experiences. Use our most popular design and development resources to jumpstart your latest project. They have pretty much, we have two core aspects mentioned in these human interface, in these descriptions. One, consistency, and the other one is speed up design and development. Consistency is about creating a sense of control, familiarity, and reliability for the user. Consistency increases usability. Something a user learned once can be applied over and over again in the same ecosystem. The other major point is human interface guidelines try to speed up design and development. For example, by providing design examples or giving standardized solutions for common problems. So how do human interface guidelines help in achieving these goals? Let's take a look at two core parts of typical user interface guidelines: navigation patterns and components, and how they help to achieve consistency and speed up development. Navigation patterns. Navigation patterns are something very fundamental for every app. Navigation patterns are the way a user is supposed to move through an application. There are different ways a user could move through an application. You can move hierarchic up and down in an application. You can move lateral between the same level of in the application. You can reverse either in history or hierarchy, like going back in the browser or in the mobile applications. Or you can have jumps, like most hyperlinks in websites are, where you just jump from one point to the other without where you just jump directly. And there are lots and lots of navigation patterns to achieve this. Hamburger menus, tabs, vertical navigation, breadcrumbs, menus, bottom bars, expandable lists, wizards, collapsible content, dialogues, carousels, column-based navigation, and so on. Typically, you want only a subset of these patterns in your ecosystem. To choose the right one or the right ones, because most of the time one needs to combine multiple of these, is very fundamental to an app. The one key role of a human interface guideline is to help the designers and developers to choose the right pattern for an ecosystem, because not all patterns will fit into your ecosystem. Some patterns just fell out of time, like this collapsible sidebar panels in Mozilla's pre-Firefox web browser. So you would click on here and then the content would expand and the other content would collapse. I don't think this pattern is used anywhere anymore, at least not in a sidebar. Today you would probably use some kind of tabs on the top to switch between the contents, or a vertical sidebar. Some patterns work only for some screen sizes, like this vertical sidebar. It works great on a TV, on a mobile phone not so much because you don't have the space. Or they only work for some input methods, like touch is not as accurate as mouse, so the interface and the patterns need to adjust to it. And some patterns might just not fit the vision you have for your platform. For example, here we see different concepts for the secondary navigation in iOS and material design. Apple is using a More tab in the bottom bar to access navigation destinations that don't fit in the bottom bar. So if you want to go somewhere here, it doesn't fit in here, so you have to push the More button and then you have a tab with more navigation destinations. On the other hand, material design would use a sidebar to access additional navigation points in here. They are both probably equally viable, but if you want to have your app to be consistent in iOS, you need to choose the More tab, and if you want to develop for material design, you should choose the sidebar. And that's something a developer or designer cannot choose for himself. You have to give him hints. So let's talk about components. Yeah, another basic element of human interface guidelines. Components are smaller building blocks of UIs. Buttons, checkboxes, radio buttons, tabs, cards, lists, and so on. Some general advice for human interface, if you create human interface guidelines for these components, give as much detail as possible. Details help to speed up design and development, and details improve consistency. You can see the difference in how much more detail Google puts in its material design documentations than Apple does in its as documentation. You have a width, you have a height, you have detailed paddings. On iOS, it's just an image. So when Google released material design in 2014, they were one of the first, or the first, to add so much details specs to their guidelines. And it was so much easier to reproduce these components for something new, a new programming language or a new framework. And it's so much easier when you look around for example, for web development frameworks. Every other web development framework looks like material design because it's so easy to recreate material design components in another technology. I searched around a bit to find one that follows Apple's human interface guidelines, and I think I found only one. But details, it's not only about expanding your ecosystem into new technologies or new toolkits, but it also helps with the creation of new controls. Sooner or later, some designer or developer will have the need for a new custom control to solve a problem that won't be covered by your human interface guidelines. So, just to showcase how this should and could work, let's say I created this very basic, maybe not overly useful and important component for my all-new material design app. It doesn't look like a material design component at all, and in fact it doesn't look very usable or pretty at the moment either. But we can easily improve it by just applying the detailed specs we find in the material design documentation. First, let's add the padding we saw in the button in the specification earlier. Now we have applied the padding here and here and here and here and here. Now it looks a lot better already. In the next step, let's apply the border radius typical for material components and add some drop shadow. Everything can be found in material design guidelines. Even better. But still not quite there. So let's take a look around material design documentation for a similar control we could use to get more specifications from. This is like this small card. So let's take the width and the height from this card and apply it together with the height we saw earlier on the button on our new control. Now it actually does look like some material design control. I'm too fast. It blends in nicely with other material design components. And because we use the same width as a standard card, we can easily use both of them together. So we could, for example, use them in the same container on the same page, store them together. It would work very nicely. And if I want to add an image like it's shown here in the card, we could just put it in here, use the same paddings and specify it over here, and improve my component even more. And in the process, only by applying all these specifications I found in the documentation in the human interface guideline, my component got much prettier and more usable as well. So especially applying the paddings makes it much better. Of course, I could do all this too if the documentation doesn't provide it. I could take a screenshot, open my drawing application and start measuring everything. It would take me hours and hours, and I would have to make a lot of guesses. Is it more important that the button has the width of 60 pixels, or is it more important that the padding is 16 pixels, or what happens if the title gets too long, is it going? Do I have to light it, or is it just cut off? Is my button growing? I have to make a lot of guesses. What are the important values? What did the designers or the writers of the human interface guidelines aim for? That you can take all these specifications directly from the material design guidelines makes it so much faster and easier to design. And it helps you not to forget some things like a padding or a size or whatever. It's the same with the typing. So I could the type no. So if I want to have a title in my control, I could just copy the font sizes from the card. It's something that all we are in the KDE human interface guidelines are missing a lot. We don't have a lot of details in our stuff, so it's hard to recreate them or to create them again. And we actually did recreate a lot because we had to create components in QML that already existed in Qt widgets. I'm sorry, I'm talking so fast that I'm pretty much through my presentation already. So to sum it up, human interface guidelines give more consistencies for an ecosystem. In design, they give more consistency in the interactions, and they speed up design and development, for example, by giving standardized solutions for common problems. Luckily, I see there are a lot of questions already in the notes. Today, all desktops have their own human interface guidelines, as they should. But for developers coming into the app ecosystem, would it be possible to have a minimum set of human interface guidelines for the app ecosystem without having to choose one? Yes. I think I don't quite understand the question. So you choose the ecosystem you want to develop for, and it typically comes along with a human interface guideline. So I don't know what you don't want to choose.
Hi, Fabian.
Hello.
Would you like me to read the questions for you, or are you okay?
I can read them too, but yeah, I'm fine with you reading them.
Okay. Say again.
You're welcome to read them.
Okay. Have you would you like me to take from the first question, or you want me to?
Sorry?
I'm going to be taking the first question. Have you attempted any of the questions? Okay. Can you hear me? I think can you hear me? Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, but
Okay, great. Sorry, I'm having some issues with my mic. 1 minute. Okay, so the second question, do you think designers from the various desktop projects will be able to collectively exchange ideas in a space like LAS or specific forum for designers on the Linux platform?
yes, I think they would, but at least for there are not so many designers because our approach to human interface guidelines is not directed from the top, rather, but so there's not a group that creates the human interface guidelines and everyone has to follow it, but it's more a process of documenting the actual development. And designers I talked mostly in the presentation are designers for applications, not for the not to write a human interface guidelines, because most designers are not no user interface or user experience experts either. But of course, there could be a lot more collaboration between the desktops and a lot of exchange of ideas. And I think something like a conference would work best, especially for design, is, in my opinion, very important to have personal face-to-face exchanges.
Mm. Okay, thank you so much. There's a third question. It says, are there any legal restrictions with regard to using material design outside Android?
Not as far as I know, but I'm not a legal expert.
Okay.
There's very many other projects that use material design.
Okay, so we still have more questions coming up for you, but then I'll go to the fourth question. How do you suggest we approach conversation between desktop and mobile and applications that are developed to work on both?
Like I said in the beginning of my talk, I'm much more in writing and structuring the content and providing images and videos and stuff like this, and in actually creating user interface patterns or design patterns. So I think you have to ask someone else who's more expert in this area than me.
Okay. Can I take the fifth question? It says, are there HIGs for VR/AR?
Yes.
Okay.
For example, Microsoft Universal Universal Platform (UWP), Universal Windows Platform covers also VR. At least they try to. That's what they say in their it's in their documentation.
Okay, so we have someone trying to quickly get a question. So it says, does Microsoft HIG cover VR/AR for HoloLens then or other devices too?
I don't know. And I guess there are other human interface guidelines for other VR stuff, like from Steam or I don't know. But there are tons of human interface guidelines out on the web.